Welcome to St. Jerome's University, and welcome to this evening's lecture on religion and ecology. My name is Scott Klein, and I am the director of the center. I would also like to welcome you to the 2007-2008 Waterloo District Catholic School Board Lecture. The board is an integral part of SJU's mission to work within the Waterloo region, and it really is wonderful to see so many familiar faces and to make new friends. This lecture is also sponsored by the Ignatian Lecture Fund. St. Jerome's is very pleased with the excellent relationship it enjoys with the Jesuits at the Ignatius Center in Guelph and at the Regis College at the University of Toronto. We also celebrate our partnership with the Eastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the Social Affairs Committee of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Hamilton, and our ecumenical partners from the Anglican, United Church, Presbyterian, and Mennonite churches as we participate in the 2007 Challenge for Change event, Another World is Possible, Living in Harmony with Creation. When you came in, you saw that there was a table with the Challenge for Change people. So Barbara's back there, I see. So if you have not yet registered for the Challenge for Change event, I know the fine ladies at the desk would be more than happy to accommodate you to register in this event that takes place tomorrow at Rockway Mennonite Church at 32 Weber Street West in Kitchener. If you have registered, or if you think you might register, we would invite you to a reception that will take place immediately after tonight's lecture in the Letson Center across the plaza. Our guest of honor at that reception will be tonight's speaker, Bede Scharper. I've asked Dr. David Seljak to introduce this evening's lecturer. As many of you know, David was a former director here at the center. He is currently the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Waterloo. And because he holds that position, he is also my boss. So I have to be very kind to David. So in saying that, I'm quite sure that David will not be kind to Stephen. So I'm pretty sure. So if you would join me in welcoming David Seljak to the podium.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to be asked to introduce my friend, Bede Scharper, and to welcome Stephen, along with his wife Hilary and son Nolan, back to St. Jerome's. In September 2001, Stephen addressed the St. Jerome's Center with a talk entitled Following the Cosmos in a Consumer Society Where Faith and Ecology Meet. And so Stephen has also taught a course here at St. Jerome's in the Institute for Studies in Theological Renewal. And Stephen and Hilary are good friends with our former president, Michael Higgins. So Stephen and Hilary are not at all strangers to St. Jerome's, and so we welcome them warmly back. I met Stephen for the first time when we were undergraduates at the University of St. Michael's College, Canada's second finest Roman Catholic institution of higher learning. And Stephen and I shared an interest in journalism, religion, and social justice. And I also met Hilary at that time, and I remember that first encounter because at first I didn't really like Stephen, and my opinions never changed. But Hilary I always liked, and I thought she was a very intelligent woman with dubious taste in men. But I think that's what Stephen saw in her, a sense of desperation and bad judgment. And everyone talks about those two things as if they were a bad thing, but desperation and bad judgment in our love partners as well as our bosses is sometimes a good thing. It works for me. Anyway, so this is where Stephen and I met so many years ago, and then we met again when Stephen came to do his PhD at McGill's Faculty of Religious Studies, where I had already been. And we worked under the same thesis supervisor, Dr. Gregory Baum, who is no stranger to this stage. Gregory has given several presentations at the St. Jerome's Center as one of Canada's preeminent Roman Catholic theologians. And in fact, when our daughter Michaela was born, Stephen and Hilary stayed overnight with our son, Daniel, who was 2 at the time. So we were at the hospital. And Daniel woke up, and there were Stephen and Hilary. And they took Daniel out of his crib, and they changed his diaper, and they changed him. And off Daniel went out to play. And then we learned that they were amazed that Daniel wet himself during the day, because it hadn't occurred to them if you take a diaper off a child, you should put a diaper on a child. And somehow this didn't come to mind. And so it was episodes like that that led the graduate students at McGill to wonder if Stephen and Hilary's son Nolan would really ever leave infancy, would ever survive to see his later years. And we're very glad that not only has he survived his parents, he has thrived under their loving, if idiosyncratic, parenting. Nolan, is this the first time you've heard your father speak in public? Okay, so you have low expectations. That's good. It's almost the key to enjoying any speaker, but especially in this case. But seriously, actually, I'm surprised that I was asked to introduce. After the last time I introduced Michael Higgins and insulted not only the speaker, Michael Higgins, but also the current president of St. Jerome's University, David Perrin, who is with us again. Good evening, David. David's come back, foolishly. So I'm surprised to be here again, but it is my job to invite Stephen, so let me do so. Stephen Scharper is Associate Professor with the Center for the Study of Religion, of which I'm a graduate, there's a plaque, and the Center for the Environment at the University of Toronto, where he is also cross-appointed with the Department of Anthropology. He has also taught at McGill University, Prescott College, the University of Waterloo, St. Jerome's in particular, the University of Vermont, and the University of Notre Dame, where he held the John A. O'Brien Chair in Ethics as a visiting professor. He has served as the president of the Religious Education Association of the United States and Canada. He is the author of Redeeming the Time, a Political Theology of the Environment, a book that I use in my course on evil, and co-author with his wife Hilary of the Green Bible, which was published first in 1993 and revised and reissued in 2002. Also, you probably know Stephen from his biweekly column in the Toronto Star on issues religious. He is co-editor with Professor Ingrid Stefanovich of The Natural City, Re-envisioning Human Settlements, which is forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press. Stephen has done research in the area of Catholic social ethics, the ethics of violence and nonviolence, environmental ethics, religion, and ecology. And he teaches these at the University of Toronto, and I know Stephen well. I've read his work, I know his students, and I know that his students appreciate his great charm, his lively intellect, and his great commitment to some of the most important issues that we face as churches and as a society. And so I hope you will welcome, as I do, my friend and a great colleague, Dr. Stephen Scharper.
Thank you very much, David. As you can discern, Professor David Seljak is one of the most gracious and lavish liars I have ever encountered. Had I known this would have been a roast, I would have looked at the Johnny Carson videos from the 1970s of the roast so that I would be prepared for this evening's repast. It's a great pleasure to be here again, and when I did teach on this campus, I had a great sense of community, of commitment, and of a shared vision for perhaps a more lightened world. And so it's a great honor to be back here this evening with you. The professional fields I try to cultivate, as David mentioned, have their harvest in the marketplace of environmental ethics, ecological worldviews, and religious ethics and the environment, especially as these pertain to the values and the place of the human within the universe itself. This is a very narrow specialization, I admit. All of this, we are sure in this room, in all of this, that we are at the present moment, environmentally speaking, in, quote, deep doo-doo, end quote. And this, of course, is a quote from another U.S. head of state with the last name of Bush. We know well, and perhaps have become a little numb too, the baleful litany of ecological horrors. And those who teach in this area have on occasion to deal with despair, not only among their students, but, if they be honest, among themselves as well. So that's why when I'm talking about some of these concerns in these kinds of contexts, I often try an attempt at humor. Now notice the language. I'm not making any claims like this is a joke. This is simply an attempt, one with an animal rights tinge. There was a hiker, an avowed atheist, near Banff, and he's walking in the forest when he encounters a grizzly bear. The grizzly bear looks at him
and starts to growl. The avowed atheist starts to run, and the grizzly chases him. And the avowed atheist, while he's running, prays to God and says, "Dear God, save me." And God says to this avowed atheist, "You've denied my existence your whole life. Why now should I assist you?" And he says, "Yeah, you're right. Okay, well, at least make the grizzly bear a God-fearing Christian." So the grizzly bear stops, and the man stops. And the grizzly bear folds his paws and bends down and begins to pray. And the grizzly prays, "Dear God, for the meal that I'm about to receive, make me truly grateful." Again, just an attempt. It used to be said after Thomas Carlyle read Malthus that economics was the, quote, dismal science, end quote. I would argue that environmental studies has now earned that dubious distinction. Let's face it, we environmentalists, as a group, can be real downers. And I've noticed this when people don't invite me to parties anymore. Are you going to invite that guy? I mean, do you know what he's going to talk about? Global warming, climate change, species. I mean, this guy depresses my cat. Please, just let Steve not come. But this gloomy aspect of our current dysfunctional relationship with the planet's ecosystems, which calls on a deep refashioning of our self-understanding and our social, economic, political, moral, and cultural systems, both invites and demands not only sobering analysis, but sustained hope. And hope not just as an individual quality, but as a societal project. And so tonight, in looking at the terrain of what we face at this time ecologically, socially, and economically, I want to accent a chord of hope. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and succinctly, not long before his assassination, "If you give up on hope, you die." This seemingly was also the experience of Viktor Frankl, a survivor of Hitler's death camps, whom many of you know through his celebrated work, Man's Search for Meaning, which was titled prior to the helpful feminist critique of exclusive language. Frankl noted that in the concentration camp, those who gathered on a regular basis to reflect on Scripture, despite the starvation, torture, beatings, and horror, all survived. Those who dropped out perished. For him, this pointed to the sustaining power of hope and of a vision. John Mohawk, the recently deceased Aboriginal philosopher from the State University of New York, once observed that in 1,000 years, when people reflect on our time, they will little remember our wars or political squabbles. They will, however, recall that this is the period in which stores of buried energy were taken out of the earth and put into the sky through the burning of fossil fuels, leading to an alteration of the planet's very climate. Whereas past ages are known as the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, the Dark Age, etc., ours will be known as the age of global climate change. All other historical events of the past 300 years, he avers, pale in comparison to this momentous event. As we all know, Al Gore has brought such a message to the world, and more close to home, to Toronto last February, when he addressed the University of Toronto community with the same message that he has brought with punchy PowerPoint graphics and self-deprecating humor to over 1,000 towns and cities across the globe, and to millions more through his book and documentary film, An Inconvenient Truth. Interestingly, this is the most successful documentary, box office-wise, in history, grossing over 51 million US. Is that 52 million Canadian today? The mathematicians here can help us. As you may know or may not, Al Gore is donating 100% of the profits from both the film and his book to a nonprofit effort helping raise consciousness around climate change. That's a lot of change. With competing statistics and compelling graphics, dramatic photos, and a well-honed, accessible presentation of scientific research, former U.S. Vice President Gore paints an arresting picture of a planetary emergency. From the melting of the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro and the polar ice caps to the disappearance of Lake Chad, once the world's 6th largest lake, now a mere mudhole. Al Gore's work builds, of course, on the findings of hundreds of researchers over the last 40 years. As environmentalist and theorist David Orr has documented, if today is a typical day on the planet Earth, we will lose between 40 and 250 species of flora and fauna. Over 186 square kilometers of rainforest will be razed at the rate of one football field per second, totaling an area the size of Austria in 1 year. So imagine going to the center of the U of W football field, around the 50-yard line, and counting 1, 2, 3. 3 times that area has just been destroyed of tropical rainforest, the cornucopias of biodiversity. The human family on this typical day will increase by 250,000 souls and will add 15 million tons of carbon dioxide, as well as 2,700 tons of chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere, all in a day's work. Al Gore's film represents what I try to call now a diagnostic moment. This is a collective moment when the Earth's vital signs are going into crisis mode, calling for immediate action. The term comes from James Orbinski of Doctors Without Borders, who was speaking with Hilary Cunningham, my wife, an anthropologist at U of T, and he was talking about what it's like to be in an emergency room situation as a doctor. When a patient comes in desperate straits, you don't have all the facts. You don't know necessarily if this person has diabetes, if this person is allergic to certain drugs, if this person has a history of seizures. You do know often the person is in a life-threatening situation. So you act based on the best evidence available and your own wisdom and experience in the field of medicine. And you act. One can't ignore the person or the ecosystem that is brought in without serious moral consequences. One can't take a coffee break at this moment with moral impunity. This is a diagnostic moment that Al Gore, building on the research of others, has helped bring to the world community. In this, Gore has provided the world a great but deeply unsettling service. He has eliminated deniability when it comes to climate change. While many citizens after World War II claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, the genocide happening around them, we, as citizens of the earth, can no longer say we didn't know about the geocide happening around us, a term used by Thomas Berry, a cultural historian and geologian familiar to many of you. Gore clearly, though, does not want his audiences to segue from denial to despair, a common transition when facing such truths. Indeed, he emphasizes the various technologies and choices for alternative energies presently available. Quoting environmentalist Bill McKibben, Gore reminds us that there is not a single silver bullet that will rescue us from our predicament, but rather a, quote, silver buckshot, end quote, approach. That there will be many good ideas from many different sources and many different regions that will help us at this time. I'd like to contrast this notion of diagnostic moment with a popular idea known as the tipping point. Many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with Malcolm Gladwell's best-selling book, The Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. In this work, Gladwell talks about ideas almost like epidemics. They are contagious, they demonstrate that little causes can have large effects, and they are kindled in one dramatic moment. So his thesis goes. There's almost a zeitgeist at which the tipping point coalesces and then cascades into a new reality. Yet I'm not sure if this idea is always the most helpful or the most accurate. And I think particularly of Rachel Carson and her groundbreaking book, Silent Spring, of 1962, which is often heralded as the fountainhead of the environmental movement. Rachel Carson got a letter from a woman near a Maryland nature reserve after it had been sprayed with DDT by U.S. government Department of Agriculture airplanes, and she noted the thousands of birds twitching and dying from the poison. Rachel Carson said, I have to respond to this. She proposed an article to Reader's Digest, which was quickly rejected. She continued to research it. She then proposed it to Houghton Mifflin, who had published earlier her best-selling work, The Sea Around Us. They gave her the green light. After doing so, Houghton Mifflin was threatened with lawsuits from various chemical companies. They said, this is an established author who does responsible research. We will not give in. As the galleys became available, The New Yorker published excerpts of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. They too were threatened with lawsuits from very powerful chemical companies, such as Velsicol. They did not back down. They continued to publish the excerpts. The book was published, and CBS News wanted to do an interview with Rachel Carson, with Eric Severide. Right before the airing of this interview, they received over 1,000 letters from unknown sources saying, be careful with this thing. She is not a responsible scientist. All the sponsors pulled out before the airing of the interview. But CBS News, which was not owned by Viacom at the time, carried on, and the interview was held. Watching that interview that night was Senator Abraham Ribicoff from Connecticut, who was so moved by the testimony of this woman that the following day he started hearings in the United States Senate on DDT use and pesticides in the United States. As a result of those investigations and hearings, DDT was banned in North America. There's an excellent documentary on this if you're interested called Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, part of the American Experience series by Public Broadcasting in the United States. What's interesting with the Rachel Carson story is that, of course, it was her courage and tenacity that was the backbone of this movement, but it was also the courage and integrity of other people along the way who did not step back from that diagnostic moment and say, we're not going to go ahead. It was a collective story of getting the truth out. And this, I think, is not necessarily a tipping point, but a very strong statement of people who stood up to strong powers, political and economic powers, with a difficult and inconvenient truth. It's interesting, just as a sidebar, Dan Rather was interviewed not long ago by Larry King and talked about why he was forced out and why other editors were fired after publishing information about George Bush not serving during the Vietnam War, as he was called to do in the Air National Guard. He claimed powerful economic and political forces were behind this. Another dimension of hope, I think, comes from some of our analysis of the power of nature itself. And here I just want to share a little personal story of a friend of mine. Not long ago, I got a call from a childhood friend, and Mike had just gone back to our neighborhood where we grew up with his son to go fishing in the ponds and streams that we had fished in when we were boys. And he said, Steve, they're all gone. Warner's Pond is filled in. Goebel's Pond is a parking lot. Twinbrook doesn't flow anymore. I can't take Pablo fishing. And I felt that a generational tether had been severed. I grieved the fact that the waters and the woods that helped shape both of us in our youth were no longer there to help frame and contour the lives of our sons. And this sense of nature loss also disturbs U.S. journalist Richard Luov, who recently published the book Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, a term that he has coined. And Luov in this book probes environmental, social, psychological, and even spiritual implications of the removal of nature from our children's lives. He reflects on his own childhood in the 1950s, growing up in the United States. He recalls that none of his buddies talked about acid rain or the thinning ozone layer, but he and the other children did have an intimate knowledge of the woods and fields near their homes. Quote, a kid today, end quote, he writes, quote, can likely tell you about the Amazon rainforest, but not about the last time he or she explored the woods and the valleys near their home. What is interesting is Lvov talks about psychological, empirical research that shows the importance of nature in healing attention deficit disorder in children, as well as other psychological maladies. And he quotes research that has been done at the University of Michigan and other universities showing improved healing for children on Ritalin and other drugs when they are exposed to nature and when they develop a particular relationality with nature. Here, his research builds on some of the intuition and research of E.O. Wilson, a biologist at Harvard, who has developed the notion of biophilia, that the human species has a natural love of the biotic community, of life itself, and that when we cut ourselves off from the natural ecosystems of the planet, we become disordered, we become disoriented, we become, in a sense, bent psychologically. This dovetails, does it not, with a lot of work that you yourselves may be involved in, whether it's in outdoor education or even in spiritual retreat work. I remember one retreat master, a Catholic retreat master of the Passionist order, telling me the only thing that he does in his retreat work is bring people to nature. They can have enneagrams, they can have all kinds of programs, etc. The main thing I do is have people encounter nature in this beautiful retreat center, and I stand back. what's interesting is what mystics have intuited, what scriptures have intimated, what poets have dreamed is now, according to Lwów, being empirically, scientifically proven by psychologists in well-known universities. What is hopeful here, for me, is the power of nature and the mysterious power of life itself. In this sense, there is a kind of unknown quantity that exceeds our grasp. I remember as a child in the 1970s being devastated when I heard scientists say that Lake Erie was dead. Some of you might remember this. One of the great lakes of this continent was pronounced dead. Devastating for a young person. Of course they were wrong. It is not dead. And what a lot of interesting land restoration and water restoration projects show is that when we give nature half a chance, nature can come back bountifully. A case in point is the Hudson River. Some of you have probably heard Robert Kennedy Jr. speak of the River Keepers, a group that he worked with. This is a great story, how this opened up. In the early 1960s, fishermen along the banks of the Hudson River in New York were so upset because they saw many companies polluting this great watershed and destroying the fish stocks. They saw the tailpipes going directly into the Hudson River. They had a meeting about it. Some talked about blowing up the pipes. Some talked about stuffing it with mattresses. Good old boy approaches. But there happened to be one person there who was the fishing editor for Sports Illustrated. And he said, there's a law on the books from the 1800s, a nuisance law, that if you destroy the commons or the common good, you not only get fined, you have to pay for the cleanup. The fishermen took this idea and began to formulate some of the most important environmental legislation in North America, culminating in the Environmental Protection Agency and the Environmental Protection Act of the early 1970s. Today, thanks to these kinds of efforts, the Hudson River is the only major waterway in North America with all its original fish stocks. The fishermen report tremendous harvests. Most of the fish they cannot sell, though, because they're contaminated with DDT from the General Electric plant north of Fishkill. But the fish that spend most of their time in the Atlantic Ocean are edible, and their numbers are growing. When environmental legislation for smog was imposed in Los Angeles, the air quality improved by 20%. Which reminds me of another attempt at humor. You're going to have to forgive me. What happens when the smog lifts over Los Angeles? UCLA. Sorry. Oh, very bad. Sorry. Yeah. Everything David said is true. That's right. But what this illustrates for me, and there are many other examples of this, is that there is a kind of reality that causes us to be humble, not only spiritually or theologically or religiously, but culturally and scientifically, that there's a lot out there that we do not understand. And this can be a source of hope as well as consternation. Also, I've been leaning on the work of philosopher Gabriel Marcel and his work on hope in light of our environmental times. Marcel has written extensively on hope as an existential philosopher, one who did become a Catholic deeper into his life. And for Marcel, hope is the final guarantor of fidelity. It is that which allows one not to despair, that which gives one the strength to continue to create himself or herself with availability to the other. This might appear to be nothing more than optimism, but that is frequently misplaced. Marcel insists that hope indeed is different from optimism. I may be pessimistic, but I remain hopeful. And this is wedded in a number of traditions and realities. One is that environmentalists and ecologists have shown us that we are deeply interconnected and reality is deeply interpenetrated. In a sense, we do not fly solo on this planet. We are not in this alone, ecologically or personally. As Ursula Franklin, the great peace activist and physicist at the University of Toronto says, we don't run the universe, we just work here. That we are not in control, that we are part of a larger system that we don't fully understand. And in our arrogance and hubris, we sometimes think that we are at the control levers. But in reality, though we have great power, and as a result great responsibility, it is not completely under our thumb or within our grasp. Interrelationship as a sign of hope. Marcel goes on to say that this does not mean that hope is inert or passive. Hope is not mere stoicism. Stoicism can be a resignation of a solitary consciousness. Hope, on the other hand, is neither resigned nor solitary. The diagnostic moment is not passive. It demands action. It does not say this is the time to not act. It says this is the time to move forward and act responsibly. In this, it is not an inert hope. Lastly, Marcel reminds us that, speaking metaphysically, quote, the only genuine hope is hope that does not depend on ourselves, hope springing from humility and not from pride, end quote. And this, I think, is, for me, a very important lesson to reflect on. For the proud person, there's often little hope. But for the humble person who remains open to new ideas and self-reflection and new models of socio-political and economic reorganization, the glimmer of hope and change remains. In this understanding of interrelationship and this notion of hope leading to humility, I think we have the lineaments of the kinds of difficult terrain that we face, but also the linings of hope as we trod through the mud and sloughs of despond that our present moment reveals. We know that we are not only ecologically challenged, but socio-economically and environmentally deeply challenged in an interpenetrated way. A few years ago, 100 Nobel laureates, partially organized by Professor John Polanyi, a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry of Canada, published a statement. This was on the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prize. And they said the two major challenges we face as a human community are the environmental crisis and world poverty. Yes, we have terrorism and threats that are real, but these two threaten us in a unique way. We know here in Canada the rise of poverty and the income gaps that exist in an extraordinary way. Canadian Policy Institute recently published a document, The Rich and the Rest of Us, showing a huge income gap that has occurred in Canada, particularly a gap between the poor new immigrants and a growing, thinning number of elites. This, sadly, is very abundant south of the border. In the United States today, research has shown us that this is the greatest gap between rich and poor in the history of the United States, including the Depression. The average CEO in the United States makes $11.7 million. The ratio of least paid line worker to CEO in the average company of the United States is 1 to 335, approximately. 40 years ago, it used to be about 1 to 30. The globalized economy that was supposed to raise all boats, it appears has simply raised all yachts. And this aggressive, globalized economy is one of the main engines of environmental destruction and one of the main reasons why nations of the South claim that they have to destroy their resources to pay their debts and enter this new global marketplace. In looking at these realities, it's important to remember, again, that we are not alone. And here, religious communities can be of some succor. Increasingly, as you know, policymakers, scientists, and politicians are turning to the religious communities to deal with such crises. They know that 85% of the world's population claims allegiance to a religious tradition. And if we are going to reevaluate our values about social justice and ecological integrity, and we don't incorporate the ethical systems of the vast majority of the world's people, we will, in fact, be in deep doo-doo. As a result, this is a new moment, particularly for people of the North and particularly for people of faith. Here, at a Catholic institution, where the tradition tells us that the divine has pitched its tent among us, and that we do not walk alone. We are called in a new way to address in solidarity, compassion, and humility the least among us, both the homeless child, the vanishing ecosystem, and the endangered chimpanzees in nations of the South. In this, we are reminded that a tradition of faith can be sustaining in this moment of humility and hope. You've often heard, the next 10 years are going to be the hardest. They always have been. It's important to remember that our traditions are there for these times, as well as more benign ones. and that people are looking to us in North America, in Canada, and in various religious communities to help us find a path out of this particular wilderness. I just want to close with a quote from a well-known religious editor and writer who once mentioned that it's only when we see the invisible that we can attempt the impossible. Thank you for being here tonight to collectively discern that which eyes cannot see. Blessings on you.
We have one question to our right.
So I really appreciate what you had to say as a long-time environmentalist myself. Now, I was brought up in both a religious tradition and a tradition in the sciences that divide up the world. And although we interrelate things within the world itself, which is an improvement, it still views us as different. Now, Michael Higgins was mentioned earlier, and he wrote a book on Thomas Merton, Thomas Merton being a mystic. The mystical approach is a parallel approach, which is too often ignored, especially in the church today. And that's we're all one with God. The left brain approach is God is the other we pray to. The right brain approach is we sort of resonate with the God which is one with us, and we are one with that God. And actually, an insight occurred to me recently that by meditating, by Sufi dancing, and so on, and linking with this God, we in effect become part of the brain of the universe, and hence are able to perhaps better meet the challenges today. So I'm just wondering, is not the mystical tradition part of your worldview? If it is, could you just expand on that aspect of your worldview?
Thank you. Yes, I think that's a very important part of the worldview, particularly a religious worldview. And it also is part of, in a sense, a philosophical worldview. I'm thinking even of Martin Buber and his work on I and Thou, in the sense that this kind of interrelationship which has been discerned at philosophical, mystical, and religious levels of not only persons to persons, but persons within the larger universe and their place, touches on a kind of mystical sensibility. What's interesting is how some of these traditions that we've perhaps pushed to the side of our common parlance are now being brought toward the center with some lights on them. I was at a conference a couple of years ago in which an Aboriginal speaker, Danny Beaton, talked about why his people, the Mohawk, go to the earth, air, fire, and water. He said, we go there because that's who we are. We are the earth, we are the air, we are the fire, we are the water. He sits down, and a retired physicist gets up and said, it's taken me 40 years to reach the same conclusions through system science and through physics, that we know that we share the subatomic level, matter and energy, with earth, air, fire, and water. A kind of mystical Aboriginal lifeway insight being validated by a Western scientist. So what Thomas Berry talks about in this regard, and most of you would probably have heard of Thomas Berry, who wrote the book The Dream of the Earth, twice was invited by Al Gore to the Clinton White House, and is referred to in Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance. What Thomas Berry talks about in this context is the kind of new wisdom tradition that is being developed between our scientific understanding of the unfolding of the universe and our religious, Aboriginal, cultural insights into reality. That in a sense, what he's trying to do is build them into a new wisdom tradition, where mysticism and, in a sense, alternative intuitions and cultural lore are incorporated and bounced off of other forms of knowing. So thanks for your question.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I have two simple questions, which might take long answers. I think they're both practical. One is you talked about the need for action amongst us, and I'm wondering what you might suggest. And secondly, I'm wondering, with mostly a Christian audience here, in particular a Catholic experience evening, where do you see the Catholic Church in addressing the issues that you addressed?
It's interesting. As you may know, the current Pope recently called climate change a moral issue. I'm glad that's been articulated at that level. There is, in terms of practicality, so much that is happening. And what is fascinating about the environmental movement, as you well know, is that we all engage the environment daily in our own lives. We all impact it in our own lives, so that we can make differences at our daily level in the way that we brush our teeth and use water and use electricity, through our institutions, our houses, our schools, our places of business, our transportation, etc. Within a Christian framework, of course, one of the interesting developments in the last 3 to 4 years here in Canada has been the campaign to stop the commodification of water. And many of you here are probably involved in that. Development and Peace in the Catholic Church, but also the United Church, Anglican Church of Canada, have also been involved in this, and most of the member churches of Canada through Kairos have been involved in this. Water for life, not for profit. And what's interesting here, in addition to letter-writing campaigns to the government, protests of the commodification of water here and in the South, there's a blending of both cosmological and social justice analysis. The Canadian bishops, several years ago, prepared a statement on this through the Social Affairs Office, where they talked about water as a right-to-life issue. Without water, you die. This is a fundamental social justice issue. So even if you're poor, you have a right to water. Even if a large company, such as Bechtel, has bought the water supply, you have a right to water. But secondly, they talked about it on a cosmological, sacramental, philosophical level. Water as so important for the Christian imaginary. Jesus' first miracle converts water into wine at Cana. Water is used in baptism and in the very Eucharistic celebrations of water and wine, that it has sacramental as well as social justice import. And so one thing that I find helpful within a Catholic setting is how the kind of new cosmology reflection of Thomas Berry and the social justice tradition that came out of World War II, reflecting on Christian involvement in anti-Semitism, working through liberation theology of Latin America, feminist study, etc., are now beginning to find common rivulets. And water and the campaign globally to stop the commodification of water and the pollution of water is one of those areas. So finding those kinds of places of commonality and common analysis, both in terms of socio-political, economic analysis of justice issues, and larger liturgical, cosmological analysis of significance of creation, are important, I think, nodes of intersection where we can work practically. I don't mean to let any congregation off the hook and the kinds of blindness that we've had institutionally in the Catholic Church to environmental issues. But in a sense, we all have a long way to go, and we all participate in systems, structured systems of oppression, not only of other people, but of the earth itself. And one thing that is helpful within the tradition of Catholicism is that social teaching that helps us look not only at personal sin, but social sin. Gregory Baum, who was mentioned here earlier, would often talk about this difference, and certain Christians think at the end of their lives they will be confronted by the divine and asked, did you obey the Ten Commandments personally? So what the social tradition says is that won't be enough. Did you engage in policies of racism? Did you engage in policies that forced poor people into the streets? That those will be the larger oral exam questions at the final judgment. And that analysis helps us now as we turn our gaze to our structured oppression of the earth. And so cultivating, learning, celebrating, investigating these traditions, I think, can be very fertile. Thanks, Dwyer.
I think perhaps in your last remarks you've already begun to respond to the thought that I had when you said about not letting us off the hook. You spoke about the rich and the rest of us. And then you talked about CEOs and their income, which made it sound like maybe I'm part of the rest of us, which I really don't believe. As a retired teacher, I see myself as being rich. And my suspicion is a lot of people in this room are rich. And so I'd like to point this out, not as a criticism, but just to invite you to comment a little bit further. Because I think when we look at the CEOs and the rest of us, I think that does tend us to let us off the hook and perhaps not see what I think is the evil of such things as the use of food production facilities or resources in order to produce fuel for us, the rich. I'm talking, of course, about the use of the growing use of ethanol. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, no, I think that's a helpful comment in terms certainly of the global community. We in North America are very rich. And as you know the stats, as well as I do, I'm sure, that we in North America, about 6 to 8% of the world's population, it's estimated consume about 40% of the world's resources. So in a global perspective, we are very privileged. And so that means there's a special responsibility here. One thing I was talking about, though, in terms of that study, The Rich and the Rest of Us, is that there has been a process of structured global neoliberal regimes that have really favored a particular elite class. And this has been documented by many studies showing the movement of capital from lower middle class, poor, and middle class up to this narrow band of very powerful elites. And this is quite a dramatic shift in economic resources being displaced. So there's kind of a structured dimension here of neoliberalism that has been pointed out. So in addition to kind of normal capitalist processes, this kind of neoliberal bumping up of resources to a thin band of elite is a hallmark of globalization and neoliberal kind of opening up of economies for the last, say, 30, 40 years. So that's one thing. In terms of ethanol, and I mean, this is always important, where we have to reflect on who is choosing certain alternative technologies and who is choosing others. When the Bush administration got behind hydrogen-powered cars, for example, or gets behind ethanol, you often, when you do your research, see a long line of environmentally destructive and also some potentially environmentally damaging technologies around that. And then we ask, well, why are certain technologies favored and others not? In response to that, I'd recommend an excellent documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car?, which shows the decision by General Motors and other corporations to destroy the EV1 and EV2, Electric Vehicle 1, Electric Vehicle 2, which were successful electric vehicles in the early 2000s in California. And the documentary shows how General Motors, to comply with the zero-emission law of California, created a viable electric car. However, they also lobbied the California Emissions Board to remove the zero-emission restrictions. Once they were successful in doing that, they had no need of the electric car. And it's one of the few films where you see people actually committing civil disobedience to save their cars from being squashed, you know. It's like a 60s rally at a Vietnam War protest, and yet these people who had leased these cars want to buy them, and they're not allowed to buy them. And they engage in a vigil and civil disobedience to try to protect their cars as they're taken off and squashed. There's only one EV1 left. It's in a museum, and it's totally disemboweled in terms of electronic motor. So this becomes a socioeconomic political conversation about why certain technologies are advanced and others aren't. And so I think that's an invitation that some aspects of religious traditions and the Catholic Church traditions of social analysis invite us to take up in relationship to our technology and our environmental predicament.
It's against my nature, but I'll be nice. Thank you for your wonderful talk, Stephen. I'm glad you did bring up the issue of class, because very frequently that issue kind of gets washed out in a general mea culpa, we're all to blame, and we lose sight of the fact that our society is structured in an unequal way, and that there are powerful forces pushing us in one direction, powerful forces that people in this room cannot control. Anyway, I wanted to ask, you talked about dialogues with various people. What about conservative Christians? I find very often at events like this, our conservative Christians get left out of the conversation. Studies show that some fundamentalist Christians are less likely to support an ecological agenda than others, and yet there are also some signs that even conservative evangelical Christians are also on side with the ecological agenda. Thank you.
There's a recently released film by Bill Moyers called Is God Green?, which looks at the rise of evangelical Christians and fundamentalist Christians in the United States as they embrace the environmental movement and some of the opposition that this has garnered. Richard Cizik, who is the president of the National Evangelical Association of the United States, I think that's the acronym, was influenced deeply when he went to England and met with members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, some of whom were deep evangelical Christians. And they talked to him and said, this is a serious issue. Sir John Houghton, for example, of the UK, one of the scientists on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change who won the Nobel Prize just recently with Al Gore, talked to Richard Cizik as a Christian, as an evangelical conservative Christian. And it helped turn him around to make this a major issue among evangelicals. This is just not new either. As many of you know, in 1990, a group of 32 world-renowned scientists, including Stephen Jay Gould, Carl Sagan, E.O. Wilson, Freeman Dyson, and others, wrote an open letter to the religious communities, basically saying, our data shows a dramatic environmental crisis brewing. We've worked with politicians. We can get laws changed. Other administrations come and ignore those pieces of legislation. We know that unless we change the habits of the heart, to quote sociologist Robert Bellah, and make this value system something that is in the very marrow of the people of our cultures, we're getting nowhere. And that's your job as religious educators. As a result, various religious partnerships were formed, including the National Religious Partnership for the Environment. One of those is the Evangelical Environmental Network. Interestingly, that Evangelical Environmental Network in the mid-90s, when in the United States you had the ascendancy of a conservative voice in Congress, and Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House as a Republican, and he was trying to eradicate environmental legislation, particularly the Endangered Species Act, evangelicals got up on their hind legs and said, the earth is the Lord's, it is not yours. And they snapped back. And many sociologists claim, and other observers, that the evangelical network was very much a part of Newt Gingrich having to step back from that destruction of the Endangered Species Act. In fact, he was quoted on one of the Sunday morning chat shows as saying the biggest blunder of his previous year when this happened was not understanding rank-and-file evangelical disagreement with their environmental agenda. You've all heard of the WWJD movement. What would Jesus do, right? Well, this evangelical network has WWJD. What would Jesus drive? And it certainly wouldn't be an SUV, they say. So it's their anti-SUV campaign. What's interesting, too, in this film, Is God Green, by Bill Moyers, is you see a very conservative, Republican card-carrying, hunting, National Rifle Association pastor in Boise, Idaho, coming to grips with the environmental crisis and giving his first sermon on earth care. And what's interesting is the language. He says, we're not doing this for Mother Earth. We're doing this for Father God. And he gets a standing ovation, and then you see the whole congregation out planting trees with the National Forest Service, you know. And they're saying, yeah, we never had evangelicals here with us, but we're happy to have them. And what was interesting with these conservative Christians who felt guilty about their concern for the environment finally got permission from their pastor to take this on the road. And Professor Klein can talk much more adroitly about this. But anyway, this is what is fascinating, the strange bedfellows that are that are forming over the environment. And Calvin DeWitt, who is an evangelical literalist, in a sense, in Michigan, he runs the Osable Institute, an environmental institute from a conservative evangelical vantage point in Michigan, says that, in a sense, the commandment to Noah was the first Endangered Species Act of the world. These critters are going to be destroyed. No, you got to take care of them. Okay. And he's one of the ones who stood up when Newt Gingrich tried to shred environmental legislation. So they've been involved, but they're becoming more involved. And even the head of the 700 Club, Pat Robertson, admitted that it's getting kind of warm in here, and maybe humans do have something to do with climate change.
I have a question. If, as you say, big business is perpetuating war and environmental destruction in order to make money, and there's this strong desire to make more money and more money, how can we change that? How can we make businesses not do all that stuff?
Well, the Dalai Lama was in town. Maybe, in Toronto we could ask. Some of you have seen the film, I'm sure, The Corporation, by Joel Bakken, and the book by Joel Bakken, a UBC law professor. There's a segment there with a CEO, Ray Anderson of Interface Carpet. What's very interesting here is the case of a CEO who says, I should be in jail for what I've done to the environment, in the toxins I've released, in the chemicals I've produced, and the destruction I've caused. And I hope in 20 years people like me will be put in jail. What happened to Ray Anderson was he was asked by some of his senior staff to do a presentation on the environmental policy of Interface Carpet. And he smiled and then said, what environmental policy? We don't have one. So he starts to scramble. And he comes across a book by Paul Hawken called The Ecology of Commerce. Paul Hawken and Amory Lovin's work at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which works particularly with corporations on transforming their understanding of economy. So instead of gross national product or gross domestic product, they look at gross earth product. So for example, you have to count the cost, the externalities of environmental destruction. If you want the hardwoods from the Brazilian tropical rainforest and you destroy those to harvest the hardwoods, but you don't have any plan for reseeding or doing it in a way that you will continue to have hardwoods, you have to take that into your cost accounting. That's going to be an earth deficit, and you won't have that anymore. Consequently, it's changed the way certain corporations have begun to do business. So Ray Anderson, in a sense, had a metanoia. He had a conversion experience. And if you go on the Interface Carpet website, you see all of the data about how they've reduced their environmental footprint, how they now change their products so that if you have an interface carpet and part of it is worn, you don't get rid of the whole carpet. They've made it so that you can just remove those particular patches, recycle it, and then have a new patch put on. They don't use the chemicals they used to use on it, etc. It's just one example of how one CEO did business differently. He's now an evangelist for this movement and speaks all over the world about how businesses can change. Al Gore, in his book, Earth in the Balance, talks about some of these issues from a political economic perspective. And what is interesting is the head of Royal Dutch Shell, about 8 months ago, maybe less, said, we need Kyoto. We need Kyoto because we need a common bar. We don't want any wildcat companies going out too far ahead of us environmentally because they're going to get the business when, in a sense, legislation changes. We want a unified standard, and that's Kyoto. And critiquing the Bush administration for denying climate change and not signing Kyoto. So you do have certain business people. For example, I was speaking at St. Mary's University in Calgary, Alberta. And this is a little Catholic crocus in the tar sands. Fascinating small Catholic university of a liberal orientation with Professor Terry Downey from this institution, from Waterloo, who's the president. And there were lots of oil people in the audience. And one of them came up to me and he said, we need to hear this because we have people leaving our industry when they fly over the tar sand and they see the destruction and they weep and they're leaving us because it's so pernicious and so heartrending they can no longer work in our industry. So there are many ways to approach this. You will find, I'm sure, a workable, good way yourself. And that's, again, part of the niftiness, if you will, of this movement. Just as there's biodiversity in nature, there's biodiversity in our cultural, psychological, religious approaches. There won't be one way. And appealing in a multifaceted way to various constituencies in a kind of biodiversified model, I think is very hopeful and a very positive way of looking at change.
Hi, you answered most of my question in your previous answer. One of the questions I had is, you mentioned before that 85% of the world's population follow a certain religion, and that's an effective way of reaching the general population. Whereas in our society, we have like mega corporations that control a lot of the products that we buy. We can't very well have stop buying their products all the time if they're not going to follow the economical, the environmental goals that we think they should follow. So what ways can we reach those corporations in an effective way? You previously mentioned that there's these campaigns, but with some scientists and environmentalists predicting not a whole lot of time for gradual change, that they need to do something now. What are some effective ways that we can reach the big businesses that control most of our world, given the fact that we can't very well reject them outright because we depend on them so much?
I mean, it's a very good and multi-layered and complicated question. I think one thing that I've learned from some of the social analysis in religious circles that is done is how you begin to do social analysis. There's an old but good book by Peter Henriot, Henriot, called Social Analysis. When you're facing the closure of an auto plant, when you're facing toxics in your water, when you're facing rabid homelessness, and you want to do something about it, there are steps to do the social analysis to find out where the power points are, where your strengths are, where your faith drives you. This is a faith-driven book. And there's a schema for doing social analysis. So that book might be helpful on a pragmatic level. On a kind of deeper level, there is the realization that we put people in Ottawa and at Queen's Park who are making major decisions about our lives. And it looks like there'll probably be, a federal election coming up. And I think this becomes a very important issue because a lot rides at certain times on some of the choices these political people make. That's one area that people do as environmentalists, and they go into political work for that kind of initiative. So that certain things like water will not be privatized under a federal government. And if it is, then it becomes part of NAFTA, and it's treated like oil and hardwood or softwood lumber as a commodity. So doing a social analysis around a political vantage point is another area to look at. But again, I hesitate to tell anyone what to do. This is what I find invitational is there is so much that we can do on a daily basis that has certain ripple effects. But what I would encourage us to do is not to forget a political economy, in a sense, a social, economic, cultural, and political analysis, as well as our own personal stories and journeys, that these have to kind of both infuse and inform our decisions.
I was becoming quite inspired by your talk until the last portion where you mentioned that others will be looking to the church for hope. And then I began to despair again. Now, I began to despair because in the last 3 or 4 decades, the phrase environmental crisis has been tossed around, and it's been the secularist, the naturalist, the atheist. These have been the voices in the wilderness, and the church has been off to a very slow start. So I'm wondering what it is about religion that perhaps kind of disables us or retards us to look at this issue and take action.
Great question. And this is happening. For example, Max Olschlager, who is an environmental philosopher who wrote a book, Caring for Creation, talks about being an environmental activist in the late 60s. And this is when the famous article by Lynn White Jr. was published, The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, which basically says Christianity, as the world's most human-centered or anthropocentric religion, has led to aggressive Western-style technology that has destroyed the earth. And that therefore we need to critique the human-centeredness of Christianity and reinvent Christianity to be more embracing of the biotic community. What's interesting was that particular article was reprinted in over 300 activist newsletters and magazines in 1967. Audubon Society, Sierra Club, etc. Max Olschlager was one of those young activists who read that and said, yes, I can't trust anyone over 30 anyway, and a lot of these clerics are over 30, and they don't understand my new sexual revolution and my smoking weed, etc. They're not part of really our allies in certain movements, so we're going to reject them. The president of Sierra Club United States, about 5 or 6 years ago, publicly apologized to the churches for swallowing holus bolus this argument by Lynn White and not turning to the churches. Max Olschlager, and I agree with you, I get scared about this, says the churches, or at least the faith communities, are perhaps our last great hope. So this is happening on behalf of secular, atheistic policymakers, environmentalists, etc. Part of it's an act of desperation. Part of it's cattle prod to the religious communities. Some scholars of religion and some practitioners say the churches are rarely at the forefront of social movements. They rarely are. But when they do come on board, because they're large and often conservative institutions, but when they do come on board, they can be very powerful and they can help educate people on a huge front of consciousness raising, activism, fundraising, etc. It doesn't. I'm not saying the churches are their last great hope, but I'm saying people are turning to churches now, as has Max Olschlager, and that is an important moment. I mean, how the churches are going to respond at this diagnostic moment is going to have huge implications for, I think, the future of ecosystems as well as of social justice structure.